Rita Glusman. How far would you go to protect the life you built? When do dreams become chains that bind you to choices you never imagined making? For one woman, the answer lay hidden behind decades of sacrifice, activism, and a hunger strike that once made headlines around the world. But in April of 1996, that same determination would lead to a decision so unfathomable it would shock a nation and raise questions about where the line between victim and perpetrator truly lies. Rita Shapiro was born in 1948 in the Soviet Union, in a world where survival meant learning to fight for every opportunity. Her childhood in Ukraine was marked by hardship that most could barely comprehend. Her parents had survived the Holocaust, carrying trauma that echoed through generations. At just 10 years old, she experienced a violation that would haunt her for life. When she told her mother about the assault by a police officer, the response was silence. "Don't speak of it. Don't tell anyone." The message was clear. In their world, some battles couldn't be fought. By the time she was 11, her mother left her for 2 years, abandoning Rita to care for her younger sister alone. These were not years of childhood innocence, but of scavenging through garbage, depending on neighbors' handouts, clinging to survival by her fingernails. Is it any wonder that when she finally found stability, she would do anything to keep it? She married Yakov Glusman in 1969, a man she had known since childhood. Yakov was brilliant, a scientist with aspirations that reached beyond the Iron Curtain of Soviet control. When Rita's family finally received permission to leave for Israel in 1971, there was one problem. Yakov wasn't included. The Soviet government refused to let him go. For most people, this would have meant heartbreak and separation. For Rita, it meant war. What she did next transformed her into an international activist. Pregnant and desperate, Rita relocated to the United States and launched a campaign that captured global attention. She spoke at forums, met with UN officials, and convinced some of the most powerful people in the world to advocate for her cause. George H.W. Bush, Secretary General U Thant, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. She even went on an 18-day hunger strike to generate pressure on Soviet authorities. Can you imagine the strength that required? The willpower to starve yourself for nearly 3 weeks, all for the man you loved. It worked. After years of relentless advocacy, Yakov was finally allowed to leave in November of 1971. They reunited in Vienna, then settled in Israel, before eventually moving to the United States in 1977. Rita had fought the Soviet Union and won. She had moved mountains. Together, they built what looked like the American dream. By the 1980s, they had established themselves on Long Island in New York. Yakov worked as a molecular biologist, researching treatments at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Rita launched her own technology company called ECI Technologies, with Yakov's help. They lived in an affluent home in Upper Saddle River, New Jersey. They had a son. They had wealth. They had everything Rita had once starved herself to achieve. But beneath the surface, something was fracturing. The marriage that had survived international borders and political oppression couldn't survive the quiet erosion of daily life together. By 1995, Yakov moved out. He wanted a divorce. Court documents later revealed there had been difficulties in their relationship, with both parties making accusations. Yakov claimed Rita was controlling and spent excessively. Rita believed Yakov was involved with another woman, a scientist in Israel named Raisa. The divorce proceedings turned bitter. Rita reportedly had Yakov's phones monitored and attempted to use photographs to influence the situation. But here's what made everything more complicated. The company they built together, ECI Technologies, was worth approximately $1.5 million. After lengthy negotiations, Yakov agreed to give Rita the bulk of their assets. For most people, that would have been enough. But was it enough for someone who had once fought so hard for every single thing she had? In February of 1996, Rita approached her cousin Vladimir Zelenin, a man she had helped bring to America and employed at ECI. She told him that if the divorce went through, the company would collapse and he would lose his job. What she asked him next would change both their lives forever. She needed his help with something that couldn't be undone. On April 6, 1996, Rita and Vladimir waited inside Yakov's apartment in Pearl River, New York. They had traveled there from New Jersey, carrying items they had purchased specifically for what was about to happen. When Yakov returned home at 11:30 that night, they were ready. The attack was swift and severe. Vladimir struck first, but according to his later testimony, Rita participated actively. The woman, who had once fought so desperately to save this man, now participated in ending his life. What happened after was almost incomprehensible. While Rita worked to remove evidence from the apartment, Vladimir dismembered Yakov's remains. The body was divided into 65 pieces and placed into plastic bags. The next morning, Easter Sunday, a police officer in East Rutherford noticed someone throwing bags into the Passaic River behind the ECI building. That person was Vladimir Zelenin. When questioned, he confessed immediately and identified whose remains were in those bags. Rita disappeared after the incident, but was found days later hiding in a cottage at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory where her husband had worked. She was initially charged with burglary, but authorities quickly connected her to something far more serious. Federal prosecutors faced a challenge. Under New York law, they couldn't secure a conviction based solely on accomplice testimony without corroboration, so they turned to something unprecedented. They charged Rita under the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, making her the first woman prosecuted under this federal statute for crossing state lines to harm a spouse. The trial in January of 1997 became a media sensation. Tabloids called her various names, drawing comparisons to historical cases. Vladimir testified in exchange for a reduced sentence, describing in detail what had occurred. When he recounted certain moments from that night, Rita reportedly fainted in court and sobbed. Yakov's mother, watching from the gallery, called out in anguish. After weeks of testimony and 10 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. She was found responsible. The judge sentenced her to spend the rest of her life in prison without possibility of release. She had fought the Soviet Union and won. She had built a company and a life of comfort, but she couldn't escape the consequences of one terrible night. The story didn't end there, though. After serving nearly 19 years at a federal facility in Fort Worth, Texas, Rita's health began to deteriorate significantly. She suffered multiple strokes and was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. She could no longer walk without assistance. In July of 2020, a judge granted her compassionate release. At 72 years old, she was freed under strict conditions, including home confinement and GPS monitoring. Today, she lives quietly in Hackensack, New Jersey, under court supervision. But the questions her case raised have never been fully answered. How does someone go from international activist to convicted participant in such terrible acts? Where is the line between fighting for what you believe is yours and crossing into unforgivable territory? Rita Glusman once had the strength to move governments. In the end, that same intensity led her down a path from which there was no return. Dorothea Puente. What kind of person bakes cookies for police officers while bodies decompose beneath her floorboards? Who smiles warmly at social workers dropping off vulnerable clients, knowing those same people might never leave alive? In Sacramento, during the 1980s, one boarding house owner perfected the art of appearing harmless while running what would become one of California's most disturbing operations. Her weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was trust, and she wielded it with terrifying precision. Dorothea Helen Gray entered the world on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California. Her childhood reads like a blueprint for dysfunction. When she was 8, tuberculosis claimed her father's life. A year later, her mother, an alcoholic who frequently mistreated her children, died in a motorcycle accident. Orphaned and scattered among foster homes and distant relatives, Dorothea and her 6 siblings learned early that survival meant depending on yourself. At 16, she struck out alone, landing in Olympia, Washington, where she tried various ways to make money, eventually finding her first husband, Fred McFall, in 1945. The marriage lasted 3 years before collapsing. What happens when someone grows up learning that people leave, that stability is an illusion, that the only constant is yourself? Dorothea's pattern emerged early. She married Axel Bren Johansson in 1952, moving to Sacramento where arguments over her drinking and gambling became routine. When she was caught soliciting an undercover officer, her husband had her committed to a psychiatric facility. Yet somehow they stayed together until 1966. 2 more quick marriages followed. Roberto Puente in 1968, ending after 16 months. Pedro Angel Montalvo, who left after just 1 week. Through all this chaos, she kept the Puente surname, perhaps because it sounded respectable, perhaps because respectability was the image she needed to cultivate. By the 1970s, Dorothea Puente had found her calling. She opened a boarding house on F Street in Sacramento, presenting herself as a community resource for society's most forgotten people. Recovering addicts, the elderly, the mentally ill, the homeless, people with nowhere else to turn. Social workers praised her dedication. She wore vintage dresses and large glasses, deliberately crafting the appearance of a harmless grandmother figure. She hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. She helped tenants sign up for Social Security benefits. On the surface, she was exactly what vulnerable people needed. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, something far darker was taking shape. In 1978, authorities caught her forging tenants' signatures on their benefit checks. She received 5 years probation and strict orders to stay away from elderly people and stop handling government payments. Did she comply? Not even close. While on probation, she worked as a personal caretaker, drugging her clients and stealing their valuables. In 1982, she was sent to prison for theft. A state psychologist who evaluated her noted she was schizophrenic, showed no remorse or regret, and should be closely monitored. The recommendation was clear. This woman was dangerous. 3 years later, in 1985, she was released, and she opened another boarding house at 1426 F Street. How does someone with her history get permission to do exactly what she'd been forbidden from doing? That question haunts everyone who examines this case. Parole officers visited regularly, yet nothing raised flags. Meanwhile, Dorothea was refining her approach. She read tenants' mail, intercepted their checks, and gave them small monthly allowances while pocketing the rest. When questions arose about where certain tenants had gone, she had ready explanations. They moved away. They went to visit family. They simply left. In April 1982, Ruth Monroe, a business associate and friend, rented space in an apartment Dorothea owned. Within weeks, Monroe was found deceased from a combination of codeine and Tylenol. When questioned, Dorothea explained that Monroe had been depressed about her husband's illness. Authorities ruled it a self-inflicted incident. Nobody investigated further. Would things have been different if they had? How many lives could have been saved if someone had looked closer? Weeks later, a tenant named Malcolm Mackenzie accused Puente of drugging him and stealing his pension. But by then, she had already begun corresponding with 77-year-old Everson Gilmouth while in prison. When she was released in September 1985, Gilmouth picked her up. By October, She wrote to his sister saying they planned to marry in November. Instead, she hired a handyman named Ismael Flores to build a large storage box. She gave him Gilmouth's truck and $800 as payment. Days later, that box, now weighing 300 pounds, was dumped near the Sacramento River. On January 1st, 1986, a fisherman found it. Inside was a severely decomposed body wrapped in plastic bags with mothballs and deodorizer. It wouldn't be identified as Gilmouth until December 1988. Meanwhile, Dorothea forged letters to his family and cashed his checks for months. The pattern continued. Betty Palmer arrived at the boarding house in fall 1986. By October, Dorothea had obtained a California ID with Palmer's information, but her own photograph. More tenants disappeared. More checks got cashed. Neighbors noticed a homeless man Dorothea called Chief, digging in the basement and yard, laying fresh concrete before he too vanished. November 1988 brought everything into focus. Alvaro Montoya, a developmentally disabled tenant with schizophrenia, failed to show up for meetings. His social worker reported him missing. Detective John Cabrera arrived at 1426 F Street to investigate. Dorothea was friendly, cooperative, offering coffee and conversation. But when Cabrera noticed disturbed soil in the yard and began digging, he uncovered human remains, then another and another. 7 bodies total, buried throughout her property. During the excavation, police allowed Dorothea to walk to a nearby cafe for coffee. She never returned. She fled to Los Angeles, where she struck up a conversation with an elderly pensioner at a bar. He recognized her from news reports and called authorities. When she was arrested, she was charged with 9 counts. The trial in Monterey County in February 1993 became a sensation. Defense attorneys argued the victims died of natural causes. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of drugging and theft. The jury convicted her of 3 counts, unable to reach verdicts on 6 others. She received 2 life sentences. Until her passing in 2011 at age 82, Dorothea Puente maintained her innocence. She even co-authored a cookbook from prison, collecting family recipes as though she were just another grandmother sharing her culinary knowledge. The boarding house at 1426 F Street still stands, now privately owned, with darkly humorous signs warning trespassers. But the questions her case raises remain unanswered. How did someone so clearly dangerous slip through so many safety nets? How many warning signs were ignored? And what turns a person from caregiver into predator? Dorothea Puente proved that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who look threatening. Sometimes they're the ones offering you a warm meal and a place to stay. Velma, Death Row Granny, Barfield. When someone brings you a home-cooked meal, you assume it's an act of kindness. When a Sunday school teacher offers to care for your elderly parent, you call it a blessing. And when a devoted daughter tends to her sick mother's bedside, you witness what love looks like. But what happens when all 3 of those gestures come from the same person, and that person is quietly ending lives instead of saving them? In the small towns of North Carolina during the 1970s, a woman perfected the deadliest form of caregiving America had ever witnessed, and nobody suspected a thing until it was far too late. Margie Velma Bullard came into this world on October 23, 1932, on a tobacco and cotton farm in rural South Carolina. She was one of 9 children raised in a strict Pentecostal household, where faith was everything and mistakes were met with harsh punishment. Her father's temper was well known in the family. The beatings she endured left scars that never fully healed, and her mother's refusal to intervene taught Velma a lesson she would carry for life. Sometimes the people who should protect you simply won't. At 17, she saw marriage as her escape route and dropped out of school to wed Thomas Burke. For more than 15 years, Velma and Thomas lived what appeared to be a normal life in Parkton, North Carolina. They had 2 children together, Ronnie and Kim, and built routines that looked like any other working family's existence. But in 1965, everything shifted. Thomas was involved in a serious car accident that left him with constant headaches and pain that medication couldn't quite touch. He turned to alcohol to cope, drinking more heavily with each passing month. The man Velma married slowly disappeared into someone she barely recognized. Then, in 1969, while Velma was out running errands, their house caught fire. Thomas died from smoke inhalation. The circumstances seemed tragic but not suspicious. A grieving widow, Velma moved forward with her life. Just months later, she began dating Jennings Barfield, a widower who seemed like a fresh start. They married in August of 1970, but the marriage lasted only 7 months. In March of 1971, Jennings died suddenly of what doctors called heart failure. 2 husbands, both gone under circumstances that raised no alarms. How many coincidences does it take before someone starts asking questions? Velma moved in with her parents in Fayetteville. Her father passed away from lung cancer not long after. Then, in the summer of 1974, her mother Lillian began experiencing severe stomach pain. She was hospitalized, treated, and sent home when symptoms improved. By December, the illness returned with a vengeance. Lillian was rushed to the hospital and died within 2 hours of admission. Doctors couldn't diagnose what killed her. No autopsy was performed. Another death, another mystery that nobody investigated. By 1975, Velma's life took a turn that should have been a warning sign. She was convicted of writing bad checks and served 3 months in prison. When she was released, she found work as a home health nurse, caring for elderly couples who needed help. Montgomery and Dolly Edwards hired her in 1976. Montgomery, 94 years old, died in January of 1977. His 84-year-old wife Dolly followed in March, succumbing to what seemed like a stomach virus. Velma was then assigned to care for Record and John Henry Lee. In June of 1977, John Henry died after experiencing intense stomach and chest pain, along with severe vomiting and diarrhea. The diagnosis? Another stomach virus. Do you see the pattern yet? Because the doctors treating these patients didn't. Not until 1978, when Stuart Taylor, a tobacco farmer and Velma's boyfriend, became violently ill after consuming food and drinks she prepared for him. Velma played the devoted partner, taking him to the hospital and staying by his side as his condition worsened. He died on February 3, 1978. But this time, an autopsy was ordered. The results changed everything. Arsenic. Stuart Taylor had been poisoned. When authorities arrested Velma and began investigating her past, they uncovered a trail of bodies that all led back to one person. They exhumed the remains of her mother, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee. Every single one tested positive for arsenic poisoning. Confronted with mounting proof, Velma confessed to 4 separate acts, though she claimed she never meant to end their lives. She said she only wanted to make them sick enough to buy time to replace money she had stolen to feed her addiction to prescription tranquilizers and painkillers. Does that explanation make sense to you? Can poison dosages be that precise, that controlled? Her trial in 1978 focused on Stuart Taylor's case. The prosecution presented clear forensic links between Velma and the arsenic-based rat poison that ended his life. Her defense team emphasized her struggles with drug dependency, painting a picture of a woman whose judgment had been destroyed by pills. They argued she was battling demons beyond her control. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a verdict of guilt. The judge handed down a capital sentence, making Velma Barfield the first woman to receive such a punishment in the modern era after its reinstatement in 1976. For 6 years, Velma lived on a specialized unit at Central Prison in Raleigh, the state's only female inmate facing such circumstances. During that time, she became a born-again Christian and devoted herself to prison ministry, counseling other women behind bars. Religious leaders, including Billy Graham, praised her transformation and advocated for mercy. Appeals were filed repeatedly, arguing that her drug addiction during trial had left her unable to assist in her own defense. Every single appeal was denied. On November 2nd, 1984, at 2 in the morning, Velma Barfield was led into a chamber at Central Prison. She wore pink cotton pajamas instead of the standard prison dress. Her last request for a meal, cheese, doodles and Coca-Cola. She released a statement expressing sorrow for the pain she had caused and thanking those who supported her. At 2:15 a.m., she became the first woman put to death by injection in United States history, and the first woman executed in America since 1962. Her story raises questions that still echo today. How did someone move through so many victims without triggering suspicion? What turns a caregiver into a killer? And where does accountability begin when addiction clouds judgment? Velma Barfield showed us that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives with a warm smile, a Bible verse, and a plate of food you'll never finish. Sarah Hartsfield. How many times does someone have to walk away from a partner's death before the pattern becomes impossible to ignore? When does tragedy stop being coincidence and start revealing something far darker? In the case of one Texas woman, it took 5 marriages, multiple investigations, and a determined rookie detective to finally connect the dots that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. By the time the truth emerged, a trail of suspicion stretched across 2 states, and the question wasn't just what happened, but how it had gone unnoticed for so long. Sarah Jean Hartsfield grew up in the late 1970s and early 80s, eventually meeting her first husband while they were still in high school. Titus Noenschild was her sweetheart, the kind of relationship that starts young and feels like it might last forever. They married as teenagers, full of hope and plans for the future. But that future unraveled quickly. According to Noenschild, the relationship turned dark almost immediately. He later told investigators that Sarah threatened him during their separation, warning him not to be surprised if he didn't survive their divorce. They split by 1995, but he claimed the harassment continued for years afterward. In 2008, she allegedly showed up at his Fort Hood office repeatedly until he obtained a no-contact order. For 27 years, Noenschild said he looked over his shoulder, wondering if the threats would ever become reality. Sarah moved on to her second husband in the mid-1990s. Records show an assault incident involving this partner, though details remain sparse. That marriage also ended in divorce. By the late 1990s, she had married husband number 3, Christopher Donahue. They had 4 children together and both served in the Army, spending much of their time stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. But like the marriages before it, this relationship deteriorated. Christopher filed for divorce in 2017. Sarah moved to Minnesota with 3 of her children and a new partner, David Bragg. They became engaged. Then came May 9th, 2018. Inside their home northwest of Minneapolis, Sarah shot and ended David Bragg's life. She told authorities he had fired at her first, forcing her to return fire. The Douglas County Attorney's Office reviewed the case and concluded she had no reasonable possibility of retreating, ruling it justified self-defense. Nobody questioned her version of events. At the time, it seemed like a woman had survived a terrifying domestic violence situation. Case closed. But 2018 wasn't finished with Sarah Hartsfield. That same year, just months before the incident with Bragg, another death occurred. Rebecca Kunzer, the longtime partner of a man named David George, passed away on January 31st. 7 months later, in August, George's house burned down. Sarah had been living in that very home after Bragg's passing. By the summer of 2019, Sarah and David George were married. She was wife number 4. That marriage lasted until 2021. In February of 2022, Sarah married Joseph Hartsfield, whom she had met online. He became husband number 5. For Joseph, a 46-year-old diabetic man hoping to build a life with someone, the relationship seemed promising at first. But by December, less than a year into the marriage, things had fallen apart. Facebook messages Sarah sent to friends reveal her frustration. She called him a nightmare, complained he was looking for a meal ticket, and said she had a plan to get out of the relationship. Joseph's family noticed the shift too. His sister testified later that Joseph told her in the weeks before he became ill that he planned to leave Sarah. Then he said something that would haunt his relatives forever. He told them he was worried Sarah would end his life while he slept. His sister begged him not to go back to her. On the morning of January 7th, 2023, Joseph's blood sugar levels began crashing. Hours passed before Sarah called 911. When paramedics arrived, Joseph was in a diabetic coma. He was rushed to a hospital east of Houston. Medical staff noticed something odd. Despite receiving glucose, Joseph's blood sugar kept plummeting. It was as though something was counteracting every intervention they attempted. Messages sent from Joseph's phone to Sarah's that morning showed his driver's license, a wedding photo, bank account details for an account he had recently opened, and a key for his Apple Legacy contact, which would allow her to access his phone data after his passing. Who sends those things hours before a medical emergency unless someone knows what's about to happen? Joseph died on January 15th. The Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences determined his cause of passing was complications from toxic effects of insulin. His manner of ending was listed as undetermined, meaning they couldn't definitively say whether it was accidental, self-inflicted, or caused by another person. But hospital staff had already raised red flags. Nurse testimony revealed that Joseph's insulin levels were extraordinarily high 4 to 6 hours before Sarah called for help. His glucose monitor had been sounding alarms for quite some time before any action was taken. That's when Detective Skylar Roch entered the picture. She had been working as a detective for only 6 weeks when she caught the case. Her direct supervisors were skeptical. They told her she was beating a dead horse and should move on, but Roch kept digging anyway. She uncovered the pattern of previous marriages, the 2018 incident in Minnesota, allegations involving Sarah's third and fourth husbands regarding a possible arrangement to harm Christopher Donahue's new wife, and circumstantial details that painted a picture nobody wanted to see clearly. When she took her findings to the district attorney, an indictment followed in February 2023. The trial in Chambers County became a spectacle. Prosecutors spent significant time examining Sarah's past relationships, the 1996 assault on her second husband, the alleged arson at a family home in Missouri, and the shooting of David Bragg. Sarah's defense team argued there was no direct proof she had administered the fatal dose, but the circumstantial web was tightening. After 7 days of testimony and just 1 hour of deliberation in October 2025, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of murder. On October 10th, 2025, Sarah Hartsfield was given a life sentence in prison. She is currently 50 years old. Authorities in Minnesota have reopened investigations into David Bragg's death and the fire at David George's home. No charges have been filed in those cases yet, but the scrutiny continues. Her case raises uncomfortable questions about how many warning signs get dismissed before someone finally pays attention. Sarah Hartsfield's story isn't just about one woman's journey through multiple marriages. It's about a system that failed to see what was unfolding across state lines and decades, until a rookie detective refused to let it go. Blanche Taylor Moore, a grandmother with pearls. big hair, and a warm smile walking into a hospital room with homemade banana pudding. She's the kind of woman who quotes scripture, bakes for neighbors, and never misses church on Sunday. Now imagine that same woman carefully stirring poison into every spoonful, watching as someone she claims to love slowly dies in agony. How does sweetness become such a perfect disguise for something so sinister? And when does devotion cross the line into something we can barely comprehend? In the quiet towns of North Carolina during the 1970s and 80s, Blanche Kaiser Taylor Moore seemed to embody everything a Southern woman should be. She was polite, refined, and deeply religious. Many knew her as a middle-aged churchgoer with a grandmotherly appearance and a cool demeanor, the last person anyone would suspect of being capable of harm. But beneath that carefully cultivated image was someone whose love always seemed to end the same way, with funerals. Blanche Kaiser was born on February 17, 1933, in Concord, North Carolina. Her childhood was marked by chaos and trauma. Her father, Parker Davis Kaiser, was a womanizer and alcoholic who worked as a mill worker and ordained Baptist minister. What kind of foundation does that create? When the person meant to guide you spiritually is simultaneously destroying your family. Blanche later claimed her father forced her into situations no child should face to pay his debts. Whether true or exaggerated, the claim painted a picture of a childhood where love was transactional and survival meant doing whatever was necessary. At 19, Blanche married James Napoleon Taylor, a Korean War veteran who restored furniture for a living. They built what appeared to be a stable life together. She got a job at a Kroger supermarket in Burlington, eventually becoming head cashier, the highest position available to a woman at that time. They had 2 daughters and were married for 21 years. Then one morning in 1973, everything changed. Blanche claimed she found her husband unresponsive in bed, deceased at age 45 from what was believed to be a heart attack. Nobody questioned it. Heart attacks happened, especially to middle-aged men. Attractive and stylish, Blanche didn't remain unmarried for long. She began dating Raymond C. Reed, a divorced assistant manager of the Kroger store where she worked. According to testimony, Reed had said he and Blanche probably would have been married, except she wanted to be near her family. They were together for years, building a relationship that seemed solid if not passionate. But by 1985, something shifted in Blanche's world. On Easter Sunday, 1985, Blanche attended services at Carolina United Church of Christ. She immediately connected with Reverend Dwight W. Moore, who had divorced his wife some years earlier. Here was a man of God, a man with status in the community, a man who could offer her the respectability she craved. There was just one problem. Raymond Reed stood in the way. Not long after Blanche met Reverend Dwight, Raymond was admitted to the hospital for intense nausea and vomiting. Doctors couldn't determine what was causing his condition, which seemed to improve and decline at random. His medical condition continued to deteriorate, and doctors revised the diagnosis to multiple systems failure based on symptoms including excessive nausea and vomiting, skin rash, blood cell abnormalities, respiratory failure, fast heartbeat, low blood pressure, kidney malfunction, and numbness and tingling in his hands and feet. Each of these symptoms is characteristic of arsenic poisoning. Blanche was a frequent visitor during Raymond's extended hospital stay, which lasted through the fall. Nurses observed her spoon-feeding Reed her homemade banana pudding. Raymond died in October of 1986, never understanding what was happening to him. With Raymond gone, Blanche was free to pursue Reverend Dwight openly. They were married on April 19, 1989, but their honeymoon bliss was short-lived. Fresh from their brief honeymoon, the minister became violently ill a half hour after eating a fast food chicken sandwich Blanche had given him. He went to the emergency room with severe nausea and vomiting. 3 weeks later, he was near death at a Chapel Hill hospital. hooked to a ventilator, his liver, kidneys, and heart failing. He wasn't expected to live. Doctors threw a Hail Mary, ordering blood tests for herbicide poisoning because he had used the chemicals before his illness. The results revealed Dwight had 20 times the lethal dose of arsenic in his system, the most arsenic found in a living patient in the hospital's history. Somehow, Reverend Moore managed to survive, though he lost the full use of his hands and feet. Moore mentioned to police that Blanche's former boyfriend, Raymond Reed, had died in 1986 of symptoms similar to arsenic poisoning. That's when authorities started to exhume bodies. In the summer of 1989, workers unearthed 5 caskets from Alamance County cemeteries. Each contained the remains of someone close to Blanche. Autopsies revealed new causes for 2 individuals: Reed, whose arsenic level was 30 times higher than normal, and James Taylor, her first husband, whose 1973 death from an apparent heart attack was actually the result of an arsenic level 60 times higher than normal. 2 other bodies that were exhumed, those of her father and her mother-in-law, had high levels of arsenic, but not high enough to be considered fatal. On July 18, 1989, Moore was arrested and charged with murder in the deaths of Taylor and Reed, as well as assault with a deadly weapon for the poisoning of Dwight. Her trial opened in Winston-Salem on October 21, 1990. The prosecution presented extensive circumstantial details, marking the similarities between Reed's passing and the arsenic poisoning incidents involving Taylor and Moore. 3 different men either married to or intimately involved with Blanche had died or barely escaped from arsenic poisoning. In each case, she had motive through finances, opportunity through close relationship, and means through knowledge of and access to anti-ant rat poison. On November 17th, the jury recommended a capital sentence. On January 18th, 1991, the presiding judge concurred and sentenced Moore to face such consequences. Prosecutors later dropped the charges in the cases of Taylor and Dwight after she received her sentence for Reed's case. Now 91 years old, Blanche Taylor Moore is housed at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh, making her the oldest woman on such status in the United States. North Carolina has not carried out such a sentence since 2006, and it is more likely that nature will take her life rather than the state. She maintains her innocence and has spent her time in prison writing music and poetry while undergoing treatment for health issues. Her case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about trust and appearance. How many people did Blanche poison who were never exhumed? How many signs were missed because she fit the image of what a good woman should be? And what turns someone who quotes scripture and bakes banana pudding into someone capable of watching people suffer slow, agonizing ends? Blanche Taylor Moore proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you'd least suspect, the one offering you dessert. Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood. What happens when 2 people in love decide that taking lives together will keep them bound forever? When caregivers become hunters and the most vulnerable among us become trophies in a twisted game? In 1987, a nursing home in Michigan became the setting for one of the most disturbing partnerships in American criminal history, where the people hired to protect the elderly became the very threat they needed protection from. Gwendolyn Gail Graham was born on August 6, 1963, in Texas. Catherine May Wood entered the world on March 7, 1962. Neither woman had particularly notable childhoods, and nothing in their early years suggested the darkness that would emerge when their paths crossed. But when Graham moved from Texas to Michigan in 1986 and found work at the Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Walker, a suburb of Grand Rapids, everything changed. Catherine Wood was already employed at Alpine Manor when Graham arrived. Wood had recently gone through a divorce and was working as a supervisor among the nursing staff. Graham came in as a nurse's aide under Wood's direction. The two women became friends almost immediately, and that friendship quickly evolved into something more. By late 1986, they were romantically involved, navigating their relationship in a workplace where most people had no idea what was developing between them. For employees at Alpine Manor, Graham and Wood seemed like dedicated workers. The director of nursing was reportedly thrilled to have them on staff. They were enthusiastic, hard-working, and appeared genuinely invested in caring for the residents. Other staff members noticed they were close, sometimes playing pranks together, like hiding under patients' beds and grabbing co-workers' ankles as they walked by. The behavior was odd, but nobody saw it as anything more than two friends being playful. But according to Wood's later testimony, something far more sinister was taking shape. Wood would claim that Graham wanted to create a bond between them that could never be broken. A secret so profound that neither could ever walk away without implicating the other. That secret, Wood said, was taking the lives of nursing home residents together. The plan Graham allegedly proposed was twisted in its conception. They would select victims whose initials spelled out the word murder. M-U-R-D-E-R. 6 people, 6 letters. A macabre game that would tie them together forever. According to Wood, the first victim fought back harder than they expected, so they abandoned the spelling plan. Instead, they began targeting the weakest residents. Women with Alzheimer's disease. Women who were incapacitated. Women who couldn't fight back or call for help. Wood testified that Graham would enter the rooms late at night or during quiet moments when staff were occupied elsewhere. While Wood stood guard as a lookout, Graham would suffocate the victims with a washcloth. The attacks were quick and left no obvious signs of foul play. In a nursing home where elderly residents with serious health conditions passed away regularly, nobody questioned these deaths. They were attributed to natural causes. Age, disease, the inevitable end that comes to everyone eventually. Between January and February of 1987, 5 women died. Mae Mason, 79 years old. Edith Cook, 98. Marguerite Chambers, just 60 but suffering from Alzheimer's. Myrtle Luce, 95. Belle Burkhard, 74. According to Wood, after each incident, Graham would take personal belongings from the victims as souvenirs, keeping them to relive what they had done. However, police never found any such items when they later searched for evidence. The relationship between Graham and Wood began to deteriorate. Graham started dating another female nursing aide, who also worked at Alpine Manor, and eventually left Wood for this new partner. Graham moved back to Texas with her new girlfriend and found employment at a neonatal ward in a hospital in Tyler. The partnership that was supposed to last forever had ended, but the secret remained. Wood, now alone and reportedly feeling immense guilt, eventually confided in her ex-husband, Ken Wood. On October 7th, 1988, Ken walked into the Walker Police Department with an almost unbelievable story. His ex-wife had told him she and another woman had been involved in a series of deaths at Alpine Manor. Detective Roger Kalaniak later recalled that his initial reaction was disbelief. Who would harm disabled elderly people? Detectives brought Catherine Wood in for questioning. At first, she claimed it was just a joke, something she had made up. But as the interview continued, she began to change her story. She admitted that Graham had smothered multiple patients while she stood watch. Over several interviews, she incrementally provided more details, painting Graham as the dominant partner and the hands-on perpetrator. The investigation led to the exhumation of 2 victims who had not been cremated. Medical examiners searched for physical proof, but found nothing definitive. Smothering cases often leave no physical trace, especially years after death. Nevertheless, Based primarily on Wood's testimony and accounts from other staff members, prosecutors moved forward. On December 4th and 5th, 1988, both women were arrested. Graham was apprehended in Tyler, Texas. Wood was taken into custody in Walker. The trial became a media sensation. Wood agreed to testify against Graham in exchange for reduced charges. On November 3rd, 1989, Graham was found responsible for 5 counts and 1 count of conspiracy. She received 5 life sentences, with no possibility of parole. Wood was charged with 1 count of second degree and 1 count of conspiracy. She received 20 years on each count, totaling 40 years. Investigative journalist Lowell Caulfield later wrote a book about the case called Forever and 5 Days, in which he raised serious questions about Wood's version of events. Friends, family members, and co-workers told Caulfield a very different story than the one Wood presented in court. Some suggested Wood may have been the actual mastermind seeking revenge on Graham for leaving her. Others wondered if the crimes had been fabricated entirely. Graham remains incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan, maintaining her innocence. Wood was released on January 16, 2020, after serving approximately 31 years. She now lives with relatives in South Carolina. The case of Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood left behind more questions than answers, and a reminder that sometimes the people trusted with our most fragile loved ones can be the ones we should fear most. Clara Green Carl. What drives someone to turn a kitchen into a laboratory of death? When does a marriage stop being about companionship and start being about countdown clocks? In the early 1920s, one woman discovered that arsenic mixed into food solved problems more efficiently than divorce lawyers ever could. By the time authorities finally connected the pattern of deceased husbands and disappeared property, she had already perfected a routine that newspapers would call the work of a feminine Bluebeard. Clara Eleanor Green came into the world on May 7, 1876, in Ohio. She grew up the daughter of John Green, a farmer, and Phoebe Melinda Hill. Her early years seemed unremarkable by the standards of rural America in the late 1800s. On January 2, 1897, she married her childhood sweetheart, Robert Matthew Gibson. Curiously, they married again 11 years later, on March 14, 1908, in Covington, Kentucky. Why would a couple remarry? What happened between 1897 and 1908 that required a second ceremony? These are questions that would become more significant as Clara's story unfolded. The couple relocated to Cleveland, where Robert found work as a teacher while Clara pursued her passion for writing, eventually landing a position with a local newspaper. For someone from a farming background, this was quite an accomplishment. Clara had ambition, intelligence, and drive, but she also had something else: impatience with life's financial limitations. Together, Clara and Robert developed what they believed would be their ticket to prosperity. They traveled from town to town, writing and selling books about local historic areas. The concept had promise. Small towns loved reading about their own heritage, and there was money to be made from that pride. Unfortunately for the Gibsons, the plan collapsed. The books didn't sell as well as anticipated. The dream of easy wealth evaporated. By 1920, they found themselves in Huntsville, Missouri, struggling financially and facing the reality that their get-rich-quick scheme had failed. Then Robert became ill with what doctors assumed was influenza. He died on March 18, 1920, leaving Clara a widow. She promptly collected a $3,000 life insurance policy, equivalent to approximately $47,000 in today's money. For a couple that had been barely scraping by, this was a substantial sum. Nobody questioned the illness or the death. Influenza killed thousands during that era. Why would anyone suspect otherwise? Clara didn't mourn for long. Just 6 months after Robert's passing, on September 14, 1920, she married Frank Carl. She had been led to believe Frank was wealthy, which made him an attractive prospect. But the relationship turned sour quickly. The marriage became so difficult that Clara filed for divorce in Hancock Circuit Court. When her neighbor Lizzie Maynard asked what grounds she had for divorce, Clara made a statement that would later haunt her. She replied that if the law didn't provide a way, there was always some way. What did she mean by that? Was she speaking hypothetically or revealing something darker? Frank convinced Clara to drop the divorce lawsuit by making her the sole beneficiary of his $2,000 life insurance policy. Did he realize he was signing his own fate? In 1921, Frank's elderly father, Alonzo Carl, came to live with the couple in Philadelphia, Indiana. According to Frank's brother Herman, the 85-year-old man was in good health when he arrived. Within months, Alonzo became gravely ill from an unknown condition and died in August of 1921. Clara expected to inherit property from her father-in-law. Instead, she discovered everything had been left to Frank's brother-in-law, Dr. Isles. Furious doesn't begin to describe her reaction. 2 months later, in October, Frank died suffering from the same mysterious illness that had claimed his father. The death certificate stated he died from high fever caused by cirrhosis of the liver. The very next day after Frank's funeral, Clara approached Herman to discuss obtaining Alonzo's property from Dr. Isles. Her behavior struck neighbors as deeply suspicious. Who discusses inheritance arrangements the day after burying their husband? Neighbors demanded an investigation. When authorities exhumed Frank and Alonzo's bodies, forensic analysis revealed each man had enough arsenic in their systems to kill a dozen people. 27 grains of arsenic were found in Alonzo's remains. 6 grains were discovered in Frank's body. Medical experts testified that just 2 grains were sufficient to cause death. The investigation expanded. Robert Gibson's body was exhumed from Nelsonville, Ohio. His remains also showed traces of arsenic poisoning. The pattern was undeniable. 3 men closely connected to Clara had all died from arsenic poisoning after Clara had purchased what she claimed was rat poison for pest control on the farm. The trial in Shelbyville, Indiana, became a media sensation in May of 1922. Newspapers across the country followed every development. Prosecutors presented testimony from Herman Carl about Clara's eagerness for insurance payouts. Lizzie Maynard testified about Clara's ominous statement regarding alternatives to legal divorce. Herman Moore described how Frank Carl had suspected he was being poisoned and experienced symptoms like severe abdominal pain and vomiting while Clara nursed him. Clara's defense attorney argued the evidence was circumstantial. They claimed Alonzo died from advanced age and Frank from chronic alcoholism complicated by dysentery. Clara herself took the stand, denying any intent to harm and insisting the arsenic was purchased for legitimate pest control. She professed shock at being accused. On June 3, 1922, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of second-degree murder in Frank Carl's death. They couldn't prove the premeditation necessary for first degree, but the connection between Clara and the poisoning was clear. Judge Alonzo Blair sentenced her to life imprisonment at Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis. Her motion for a new trial was denied on June 13th. Newspapers dubbed her the feminine Bluebeard and considered her one of the most daring woman offenders in the country. But Clara had one more surprise. In 1937, 15 years into her sentence, she convinced authorities she was dying from a terminal illness. They granted parole based on compassionate grounds. The terminal illness proved to be greatly exaggerated. Clara lived for another 30 years, passing away on March 3, 1962, at age 85. The case of Clara Green Carl raises questions that echo through time. How many poisonings went undetected before forensic science caught up? How did she manipulate medical professionals into accepting natural causes? And what turns someone from an ambitious writer into a serial poisoner? Clara proved that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a gun or a knife. Sometimes it's patience, access to the kitchen, and a container of rat poison hiding in plain sight. Euphemia, Lady Bluebeard, Mondich. When someone changes their name, moves to a new city, and starts over, we usually assume they're running from debt or scandal. But what if they're running from bodies? In the early 1920s, one woman turned reinvention into a deadly art form, leaving a trail of disappeared husbands and buried secrets across 3 countries. By the time authorities finally caught up with her, the question wasn't just who she had ended, but how many others had vanished before anyone noticed the pattern. Euphemia Mondich was born in 1884 in Austrian Galicia, a region that would later become part of Poland. Little is documented about her early years, but the record that does exist begins with marriage. Her first husband was a man named George Woodward. They married in their homeland, and for 3 years, they appeared to live an ordinary life. Then George died under circumstances that were never fully explained. At the time, nobody thought to investigate too deeply. People died, especially in regions where medical care was limited and poverty was widespread. Euphemia became a widow, and life moved on. Sometime during the 1910s, she emigrated to Toronto, Canada, seeking better opportunities like countless others fleeing European hardship. In Toronto, she met and married George Warpchuk. For a while, they built a life together in the immigrant community, but by 1914, that marriage collapsed. Euphemia deserted her second husband and crossed the border into the United States, settling in Detroit, Michigan. How often does someone just walk away from a marriage and start completely fresh in a new country? And why didn't anyone question what she was running from? Detroit, in the 1920s, was a booming industrial city, drawing workers from around the world. It was the perfect place to disappear into anonymity. On June 14, 1921, Euphemia married Joseph Sokolsky. They moved into a small house on Osborne Street, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she might finally settle down. But there was a complication. A 39-year-old fellow immigrant named John Udorovich also lived in the house as a boarder. The arrangement was common enough for the time. Immigrant families often took in boarders to help pay rent. But this particular living situation would prove to be deadly. Sokolsky didn't last long. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and Euphemia had ready explanations for anyone who asked. He left. He went back to the old country. He found work elsewhere. Nobody pressed her for details. After all, men abandoned their families all the time during this era, especially when times were tough. What nobody knew was that Sokolsky's body was buried somewhere nearby, hidden well enough that it would never be found. With Sokolsky gone, John Udorovich saw an opportunity. He proposed to Euphemia, likely believing she was now available. But she refused him, telling him that the neighbors would get suspicious if she remarried so soon after her husband's recent disappearance. Think about that logic for a moment. She was worried about what people would think, not about the actual crime she had committed. So Euphemia moved to a new house on Dwyer Street, hoping to create distance between herself and Udorovich. But he wasn't willing to let her go. 3 weeks after she moved, Udorovich tracked her down. This time he came armed with a revolver, threatening her at gunpoint to marry him. Was this jealousy, obsession, or did he know something about Sokolsky's disappearance and think he could use it as leverage? Euphemia initially pretended to accept his proposal, playing along to defuse the situation. But when Udorovich sat down to read the newspaper, feeling confident and relaxed, she made her move. She grabbed his revolver and fired into his abdomen. Udorovich, wounded and terrified, attempted to flee through a window, but Euphemia shot him in the back as he tried to escape. When he fell, she walked closer and fired a third shot into his neck, ending his life. The next morning, she buried his body under the house on Dwyer Street and moved away yet again. How does someone do that? Bury a body beneath their own floorboards and then just pack up and leave like nothing happened? Euphemia eventually remarried, this time to a man named Steve Mondich. They lived together for approximately 3 years with seemingly no issues. Then in September 1924, she deserted him, taking $5,700 with her. She claimed she was moving back to her native country, but Steve Mondich would later discover this was just another lie in a lifetime of deception. Detectives began investigating when they noticed patterns in Euphemia's history. They discovered she had won a divorce lawsuit against her missing husband, Sokolsky. They also learned that another man who had been in her company, Udorovich, had also vanished. 4 days into their investigation, they received an anonymous tip that Euphemia was attempting to sell property at the county building. She was arrested there and charged with murder. For more than 4 hours, she refused to admit anything. But eventually, she broke down and confessed to shooting a man and burying his body under the house on Dwyer Street. She agreed to show detectives exactly where. When they excavated the property, they uncovered a complete human skeleton. Initially, investigators believed it was Sokolsky, but they were shocked to learn it was actually John Udorovich, her lover. Sokolsky's body was never found. Further questioning revealed a staggering truth. Euphemia had been involved in a total of 9 relationships across Poland, Canada, and the United States. 9 men. How many of them were still alive? Authorities couldn't say for certain. They could only prove one ending, that of Udorovich. At trial, Euphemia entered a plea of self-defense, arguing that she was deathly afraid of Udorovich and had no choice but to act. The prosecution countered by bringing parts of Udorovich's skeleton into the courtroom, showing exactly where he had been shot. The placement of the wounds indicated this wasn't a panicked act of self-preservation. It was something else entirely. When Euphemia saw the bones, she burst into tears. The jury found her responsible, and she was given a life sentence. After the trial concluded, her 2 surviving husbands, Steve Mondich and George Worobchuk, met up and reportedly congratulated one another on staying alive before bidding her farewell. Can you imagine that meeting? 2 men who loved the same woman, grateful they had escaped with their lives. Euphemia was transferred to the Detroit House of Correction in Plymouth Charter Township, where she remained until her passing from a heart attack on August 20th, 1961. She was 77 years old. She never admitted to anything beyond Udorovich's case, and the truth about her other relationships died with her. The case of Lady Bluebeard stands as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one sharing your home, your bed, your trust. And that starting over isn't always about redemption. Sometimes it's just about finding new victims. Jane Toppen. Trust is the currency of the nursing profession. When you're sick, weak, and at your most fragile, you place your life in the hands of strangers in white uniforms, believing they'll heal you rather than harm you. But what happens when that trust becomes a weapon? When the gentle nurse adjusting your pillow is actually experimenting on you like a laboratory specimen? In late 1800s Massachusetts, one woman transformed the sacred act of caregiving into something so disturbing that even a century later, her name still sends chills through medical communities worldwide. Honora Kelly entered this world on March 31st, 1854, in Boston, Massachusetts, born into an Irish immigrant family struggling against poverty and prejudice. Her mother, Bridget, died from tuberculosis before Honora's memories could even form. Her father, Peter Kelly, was a tailor who descended into alcoholism and madness so profound that neighbors nicknamed him Kelly the Crack. He reportedly sewed his own eyelids shut before being institutionalized. How does a child survive that kind of chaos? Where does the mind go when the people meant to nurture you instead abandon you to asylums? In 1862, Peter placed 6-year-old Honora and her sister Delia in the Boston Female Asylum, an orphanage that housed over 100 unwanted girls. 2 years later, in November of 1864, a widow named Anne C. Toppin came to the asylum looking for an indentured servant. She selected Honora, took her to Lowell, Massachusetts, and renamed her Jane. Though never formally adopted, Jane took the Toppin surname to distance herself from her former life. Her sister Delia wasn't as fortunate. When she came of age, she was sent to the streets and became a prostitute. Jane's time with the Toppins gave her education and stability, but also resentment. She lived with them as help, watching their biological daughter Elizabeth enjoy privileges Jane would never have. When Jane turned 18, Mrs. Toppin gave her $50 and encouraged her to find her own way. But Jane stayed on as a servant until age 25, when Mrs. Toppin finally asked her to leave. What builds inside someone who spends their formative years being neither family nor stranger, but something uncomfortably in between? In 1883, Jane began training as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital. Something shifted in her there. The woman, who had been rejected and overlooked her entire life, suddenly found herself praised. Doctors called her skilled. Patients loved her cheerful demeanor. She earned the nickname Jolly Jane for her pleasant, upbeat personality. Finally, she had found somewhere she belonged. But beneath that jolliness lurked something darker. Jane began using patients as subjects for experiments with morphine and atropine, altering their prescribed dosages to observe effects on their nervous systems. Who lives? Who dies? What happens if I increase this amount? In 1889, Jane was recommended to the prestigious Massachusetts General Hospital. There, she continued her experiments while generously distributing opiates to almost anyone who asked. When she was dismissed for recklessly administering drugs, she briefly returned to Cambridge before being let go again. But private doctors, perhaps impressed by her apparent dedication, began recommending her as a private nurse to wealthy clients. Free from hospital oversight, Jane could finally experiment without constraints. Her pattern emerged slowly. In 1895, she ended the lives of her landlords, Israel Dunham and his wife. They had become, in her words, feeble and fussy, old and cranky. She later told colleagues there was no use keeping old people alive. In 1899, she took care of her foster sister Elizabeth, who fell ill during a vacation. Elizabeth died, and Jane received gifts through the will distribution. The following year, the Brigham family housekeeper Florence Calkins also perished under Jane's care. Then came the Davis family in Catomet in 1901. Jane moved in to care for elderly Alden Davis after his wife Mattie passed away. What nobody knew was that Jane had ended Mattie's life herself. Within weeks of Jane's arrival, Alden died. Then his sister, Edna. Then his daughters, Minnie and Genevieve. The speed of these consecutive losses finally raised suspicions. The surviving Davis family members demanded toxicology examinations. When authorities tested Minnie's remains, they found poison. Police began investigating, and on October 29, 1901, Jane was arrested in Amherst, New Hampshire. By 1902, she had confessed to 31 cases, but in conversations with her attorney, she claimed the number could be closer to 100. She had forgotten many details. How do you forget ending someone's life? Unless it happened so often, it stopped registering as significant. During her confession, Jane revealed motivations that shocked even hardened investigators. She admitted achieving intense gratification from her acts. She described climbing into beds with her victims as they succumbed to the poison, holding and caressing them as they died. Her stated ambition? To have ended more lives than any other person who ever lived. Her trial in Barnstable County Courthouse became a media sensation. Jane insisted on her own sanity, arguing she couldn't be insane if she knew what she was doing and knew it was wrong. She wanted to be found sane, believing it would give her a chance at eventual release. But on June 23, 1902, the jury deliberated just 27 minutes before declaring her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed for life to Taunton Insane Hospital. Jane spent the next 34 years in that institution. At first, she refused to eat, paranoid that staff were poisoning her food. The newspapers delighted in the irony. Her mental state deteriorated over time. Nurses reported hearing her call down the halls, saying, "Get some morphine, dearie, and we'll go out in the ward. You and I will have a lot of fun seeing them die." She died there on August 17, 1938, at age 84, buried in a potter's field at Mayflower Hill Cemetery in Taunton. Jane Toppan's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the people we trust most when we're most vulnerable. How many deaths were attributed to natural causes when they were actually something far more sinister? And what transforms someone from a discarded child into America's most prolific female serial killer? Jolly Jane proved that sometimes the brightest smile hides the darkest intentions.